I came home from a 6-mile run expecting coffee, a hot shower, maybe 20 quiet minutes before logging into work. Instead, I pulled into my driveway and saw an excavator sitting in the middle of my backyard like it owned the place. Dirt was piled everywhere, my sprinkler lines had been ripped open, and the rose garden my late wife planted 10 years ago had been flattened into wet brown mud. For a second, I honestly thought somebody had made a mistake, wrong address, wrong property, something like that. Then I saw the orange survey flags running 15 feet past my fence line, straight into my yard, and standing beside the machine, holding an iced latte like she was supervising a photo shoot, was my neighbor, Vanessa Holloway. Now, every neighborhood has that one person who treats the HOA like Congress and acts like everybody else is lucky to breathe the same air as them. Vanessa was ours. She lived 3 houses down in one of those giant white modern farmhouses with black trim that looked expensive in the most exhausting way possible. Massive windows nobody ever opened, fake stone columns, a 4-car garage for 2 people who barely drove anywhere. She'd moved in about 3 years earlier with her husband, a hedge fund guy named Brent, who always looked tired, and for a while they kept mostly to themselves. Then the divorce happened, and after Brent left, something changed in her. It was like she suddenly needed the whole street to know she was still winning. Every month, there was some new project: outdoor fireplace, custom pergola, imported palm trees in North Carolina for some reason. At one point, she had workers install speakers disguised as landscaping rocks so the entire cul-de-sac could hear smooth jazz at midnight. Nobody liked her, but everybody tolerated her because rich people with lawyers tend to exhaust normal people into silence. I got out of my truck and just stood there staring at the damage. One of the workers glanced at me awkwardly, then went right back to digging. Vanessa finally noticed me and smiled, this weird, tight little smile that never reached her eyes. "Morning, Daniel," she said, like this was perfectly normal. "Try not to panic, okay? There was an issue with the original property survey." I looked at the stakes again, then at the trench cutting through my yard. "Why is your crew digging up my property?" She actually laughed, not nervous laughter either, more like amused impatience. "It's not your property, apparently. We had a new survey done last month. Turns out this section has technically belonged to my lot the whole time." Then she took a sip of her drink and added, "Honestly, whoever built these homes in the 80s made a mess of the lot lines." I remember feeling this heat crawl up my neck because she said it so casually, like she was discussing whether, not destroying somebody else's backyard. "You can't just move a fence and take part of my yard." "I'm not taking anything," she said. "I'm correcting an old mistake." Then she motioned toward a man in a polo shirt standing near the excavator. "Our surveyor already filed everything with the county." Surveyor. County. Filed everything. She had paperwork. And that was the moment my stomach dropped a little, because people like Vanessa never start construction unless they think they're protected. She walked over and handed me a manila envelope thick enough to stop a bullet. Inside were property maps, legal notices, and a letter from some law office in Charlotte basically warning me not to interfere with the construction. There was language in there about disputed boundaries and historical usage, and something called adverse possession because apparently her irrigation system had watered that strip of land for years. I remember standing there in my own driveway reading legal threats while dirt from my wife's garden dried on my shoes. Vanessa leaned closer and lowered her voice like she was doing me a favor. "Look, Daniel, I know this feels emotional for you, but fighting this will cost a lot more than it's worth." Emotional. That word stuck with me all day, because to her, my backyard was just square footage. But to me, that garden was the last thing my wife touched before cancer took her. Every rose bush back there had a story attached to it, and Vanessa had bulldozed through all of it before breakfast. That night I sat alone in my garage drinking warm beer and staring at old storage boxes I hadn't opened in years, trying to figure out how somebody with enough money could simply rewrite reality in broad daylight. And that's when I noticed a faded label on one of the boxes. Hartwell Electric Subdivision, Plans 1987. My father's handwriting. And suddenly, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in over 20 years. My dad spent almost 30 years as an electrical contractor, the kind of old-school guy who believed every problem in life could be solved with 3 things: patience, paperwork, and a flashlight. Back in the late 80s, before this neighborhood became packed with Teslas and million-dollar renovations, he'd helped install most of the underground utility infrastructure for the entire subdivision. I used to ride around with him during summers when I was a kid, sitting in the truck eating gas station peanuts while he pointed at transformers and explained how power moved through a neighborhood like blood through veins. After he passed, my mother gave me all his project files because nobody else in the family wanted boxes full of faded blueprints and inspection reports. For years, they'd just been collecting dust in my garage. That night, around midnight, I pulled the boxes onto the floor and started digging through them. Most of it was old invoices and wiring diagrams, but underneath a stack of water-stained binders, I found a rolled-up site plan for the original subdivision utilities. I spread it across my workbench and just stared at it for a second. Then my heart started pounding. Running directly beneath the section Vanessa had claimed was the neighborhood's primary underground electrical easement. Not just cables for her house. Main feeder lines for almost the entire block. Thick high-voltage conduits buried under that exact strip of land. I grabbed a ruler and checked the measurements 3 times because honestly it felt too perfect to be real. But there it was. According to the original utility agreement, there had to be a 20-foot unrestricted access zone around the underground electrical corridor. No permanent structures. No retaining walls. No outdoor kitchens. Definitely no luxury pool expansion with a built-in hot tub sitting directly above active power lines. I leaned back in the chair and actually laughed out loud alone in my garage at 1 in the morning like a crazy person. Not because I was happy exactly. More because for the first time since this started, I realized Vanessa might not be the smartest person in the neighborhood after all. The next morning, I walked the property with the old plans and started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Small concrete utility markers half buried near the fence line. Access caps hidden under mulch. My dad used to say rich people build over infrastructure because they assume money makes the laws flexible. Utility companies don't care how rich you are. They care whether linemen can access live cables during an emergency. And suddenly everything made sense. Vanessa's contractors weren't just building close to the easement. They were directly on top of it. By noon, I had my own surveyor out there, an older guy named Rick Morales who took one look at the plans and whistled low under his breath. "Well," he muttered, "this is gonna ruin somebody's week." We spent hours documenting everything. Measurements from the utility markers. Photos of excavation trenches cutting across restricted zones. Video of workers pouring support footings where no permanent structure was legally allowed to exist. Rick kept shaking his head the whole time. "These idiots pulled permits for landscaping," he said. "Not structural work over a utility easement. If the city sees this..." He didn't even finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That evening, Vanessa walked over while we were still measuring. She had on white designer sunglasses and this fake calm expression people wear when they think they've already won. "Daniel," she sighed, "you really hired your own surveyor?" Rick didn't even look up from his clipboard. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You know this is getting obsessive, right?" I stared at her for a second because that word again, obsessive, like protecting my own property somehow, made me unstable. "You bulldozed my yard. Because legally it's not your yard." "You sure about that?" Her expression shifted just slightly. Barely noticeable, but enough. She glanced down at the utility plans in my hand. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing," I said. "Yet." For the first time since this whole thing started, she looked nervous. And honestly, that felt good. Over the weekend, I built a file so detailed it looked like a federal investigation. Original utility easement agreements. County infrastructure maps. Historical permits. Current construction photos with timestamps. Measurements showing her retaining wall-blocked emergency access requirements. I even found an old inspection memo from 1989 signed by my father warning future homeowners not to build permanent structures near the feeder corridor. Reading his handwriting hit me harder than I expected. My dad had been gone almost 8 years by then, but sitting there at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, highlighting legal sections while rain hit the windows outside, I could practically hear his voice. "Always keep records, Danny. People lie. Paper doesn't." Monday morning, I sent everything everywhere. Power company, city inspections department, county utilities office, state electrical safety board. Honestly, I figured it would take weeks for anybody to care. Bureaucracy usually moves slower than mold. But apparently there are certain phrases that make government agencies move very fast, and one of them is unauthorized excavation above primary electrical infrastructure. Tuesday morning at around 8:15, I heard heavy trucks outside. I looked through my front window and nearly spilled coffee on myself. 3 utility vehicles, 2 city inspector SUVs, and 1 police cruiser. Vanessa's contractors had stopped working entirely. Half the crew just stood there watching while inspectors walked around with clipboards and bright orange safety vests. Then one of them suddenly shouted something and pointed near the excavation trench. Within minutes, the whole site changed energy. Workers started backing away. Utility crews opened an access panel near the fence, and one guy immediately started cursing loud enough for me to hear from my porch. Apparently, during excavation, they'd cracked protective conduit surrounding one of the feeder lines. Not enough to shut power down yet, but enough that moisture could eventually reach the cables. One inspector walked straight over to Vanessa, who had just come storming out of her house in yoga pants and slippers, and started explaining something very firmly while handing her paperwork. Even from across the yard, I could see the color draining out of her face. She kept interrupting him, pointing at her contractor, then at the surveyor, then toward my house. At one point, she actually looked directly at me standing on my porch and mouthed, "Did you do this?" I didn't answer. I just took another sip of coffee. About 20 minutes later, the city posted a giant red notice on the unfinished retaining wall. Unsafe structure. Condemned, pending investigation. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy that moment. Maybe I should have been more mature about it, but after watching somebody erase part of my life with a bulldozer, seeing her luxury backyard project frozen mid-construction felt deeply satisfying. But things were about to get much worse for Vanessa than either of us realized. For the next few weeks, the entire neighborhood turned into a spectator sport. Every morning, people suddenly found reasons to walk their dogs past Vanessa's house. And every afternoon, another contractor truck or inspector vehicle showed up like clockwork. It was honestly incredible watching someone who'd spent years trying to look untouchable slowly realize the rules still applied to her. At first, Vanessa acted confident. She hired attorneys, brought in engineers, even tried claiming the city was overreacting because technically the conduit damage hadn't caused an outage yet. But utility easement law doesn't leave much room for interpretation. Once the power company determined her construction blocked emergency access to the feeder lines, the fight was basically over before it started. The worst part for her wasn't even the demolition order. It was the insurance denial. Apparently, when you build permanent structures over restricted utility corridors without proper approvals, insurance companies suddenly become very interested in fine print. Her policy covered almost none of it. The pool contractor blamed the surveyor. The surveyor blamed incomplete county records. The city blamed unauthorized construction changes. And Vanessa blamed everybody except herself. One afternoon, she marched across the street while I was trimming hedges and demanded we talk like adults, which usually means somebody wants forgiveness without accountability. She stopped at the edge of my driveway wearing oversized sunglasses even though it was cloudy, arms folded tight across her chest. "You could have warned me," she said. I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Warned you." "About the easement." I set the hedge trimmers down slowly. "Vanessa, you tore up my backyard before speaking to me once. Because your fence was in the wrong place. Then maybe you should have verified that before spending 80 grand. Her jaw tightened. "You enjoyed this, didn't you?" That question sat there for a second because the honest answer was complicated. Did I enjoy watching her lose money? Not really. But did I enjoy watching somebody arrogant finally collide with consequences? Yeah, maybe I did. "No," I said finally. "I enjoyed being treated like I mattered." That seemed to hit harder than I expected because she looked away for the first time since walking over. And for one strange second, she didn't look like the neighborhood villain anymore. She just looked tired, angry, embarrassed, like somebody who'd spent her whole life using money to outrun humiliation and suddenly discovered there were places it couldn't reach. But then she ruined the moment by saying, "You still could have handled this privately." I just stared at her. "You sent lawyers to my house before I even had breakfast." She opened her mouth, realized I was right, and quietly walked away. After that, the demolition started. And honestly, it was surreal. The same crew that had spent weeks building her luxury expansion now spent even longer tearing it apart piece by piece. The outdoor kitchen disappeared first, then the stone deck. Then the half-installed hot tub got lifted out by a crane while half the neighborhood pretended not to watch from their windows. Utility crews eventually dug up the entire easement corridor to inspect the feeder lines for additional damage. Giant trenches cut through the middle of her dream backyard project, exposing thick electrical conduits underneath like buried bones. And the whole time I kept thinking about my dad. About how many people probably walked over that infrastructure for decades without ever realizing it was there. Quiet, invisible systems holding everything together beneath the surface. Kind of like decent people sometimes. A month later, utility workers installed permanent concrete easement markers along the property line so this could never happen again. Big ugly things too, impossible to ignore. The irony was beautiful. Vanessa had wanted a resort-style backyard people would admire. Instead, she ended up with industrial warning markers running across the center of it forever. The power company also paid for restoration work on my yard since her excavation had damaged irrigation lines and landscaping. Technically, they billed her for it afterward, which according to one of the contractors became a whole separate legal nightmare. But eventually my rose garden came back. Different roses, obviously. You can't really replace something planted by someone you loved. But still, seeing color there again helped more than I expected. Around the same time, Vanessa quietly put her house on the market. No goodbye party. No dramatic exit. One day the sign just appeared out front. Rumor was the legal fees and reconstruction costs ate through most of her divorce settlement. Last I heard, she moved to Florida, which somehow felt exactly right. And here's the thing I still think about sometimes. If she'd simply knocked on my door that first morning and treated me like a human being instead of an obstacle, this entire disaster probably never would have happened. We might have worked something out. Maybe adjusted the project. Maybe compromised. But arrogance has this weird way of convincing people they don't need permission, only paperwork. And once somebody starts believing that, they stop seeing neighbors as people. They start seeing them as inconveniences. Every now and then new families move into the neighborhood and ask about the concrete markers running near the Holloway property line. And whenever they do, somebody always laughs and says, "Oh man, you haven't heard that story yet?" So now I'm curious what you think. Did Vanessa deserve what happened to her? Or should I have warned her before getting the city involved? And if somebody tried taking part of your property using lawyers and technicalities, how far would you go to fight back? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about neighbor disputes, legal revenge, and people finally facing consequences, make sure to like, subscribe, and stick around for the next one.